So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, Richard, for doing this, and go ahead.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to talk about one of my favorite topics. I appreciate the invitation to talk about the Arthur Foss. It's really an important part of our local history here. Um, and just to give you an example of that, I was just up in Port Townsend a few months ago, and just happened to be walking around in their waterfront area, and came across this painting on the side of a building of the Arthur Foss, and it's kind of a local scene because they still have an active pulp mill up there, which is kind of in the background on my right. And the Arthur is hauling a big raft of logs, which is, as we'll soon hear, a big part of its towing history. My talk will have two parts. I'll try and give some historical background for the Arthur Foss, and then a couple of years ago, the Arthur was hauled out, and I was project manager to manage that haul out project. So we'll kind of go through what that project was all about and a little bit about what we found, and then we'll wrap up. So the Arthur Foss's history is quite extensive. It was built in 1889. It's the oldest wooden vessel, wooden tugboat in the world, as far as we know, 131 years old. She is, as far as we know, one of the oldest floating wooden vessels in the Northwest. It's a National Historic Landmark, a Seattle landmark, and it's also a Washington State Heritage flagship. And overall, she's a very important part of the maritime history of our Pacific Northwest. So the Arthur started its life as, of course, another vessel name. Most vessels, including the Arthur, have gone through many names, but it started as the Waloa. It was built in Portland in 1889, and it was built to run the bar. And as some of you may know, running the bar is one of the most challenging, if not the most challenging, towing operation there is in the world. And that's because as the Columbia exits Washington, it has dumped an awful lot of silts and fines. And so the mouth of the river is rather shallow. And so ocean waves come to that area and they build up and they get to be very, very steep. So when it was built, lumber was not an issue. And so it has ribs every 12 inches, 8-inch ribs, is 4-inch planking, is built hell for stout, and that is part of the reason that it's had as long a history and is still around and still with us to this day. It was built with a 122 horsepower steam engine that was repurposed from another tug. And interesting to note at this point that 1889 is the same year that Thea Foss started her initially it was a rowboat company in Portland, and later we'll revisit why that's interesting. This is its original configuration, significantly different than today. The hull's the same, but the main cabin and smokestack, all that was eventually replaced, but this is what it looked like early in its life. So it ran the bar for several years, and then in 1898, gold was found in the Klondike, and there was a huge demand to haul barges and vessels to and from the Klondike region. And as far as we know, Arthur Foss is the last Klondike vessel that is still operational. The route to and from the Klondike was very challenging. Sometimes it would go to Skagway up the Inside Passage. Sometimes it went around the most difficult route all the way around St. Michael's or Saint Michel. That was at the mouth of the Yukon. Very few vessels actually took that route because that was very challenging, especially in certain times of the year, like in the winter months, because there's not only big seas, but also at some of the ports there was icebergs that had to be dealt with. It came back from the Klondike, and then in 1901 it was retrofitted. It was given a new cabin, new engine, and it served until 1929, hauling large rafts of logs from to and from lumber mills. This is a very challenging tow job. Hauling a raft of logs is like trying to pull a building through the water. It's a lot of pressure is put on the tow line and the vessel itself. So you had to have a big, heavy vessel to be able to move these large rafts around the Puget Sound and the greater Salish Sea. So it hauled raw lumber, raw logs, to the mills, but then it also hauled away the finished dimensional lumber to various markets up and down the West Coast. Sometimes could haul as much as 1.75 million board feet. And to give you a sense of how much wood that is, if you took a board and made it a foot wide and an inch thick, it would stretch between Seattle to Yakima. So a lot of wood moved around. Then in 1929, the vessel was sold to Foss for $1,000 and $3,500 in towing fees. And it turned out the first thing that Foss did with it was lease it to MGM for a movie called Tugboat Annie, which was probably the first major film that was shot here in the Washington area. And the vessel was used in that movie, and it was rather given a name and was somewhat embarrassed by the municipal garbage tug for the movie, but it starred Marie Dressler and Wallace Berry and a young Robert Young. So the Foss Company got so much money from leasing this vessel to MGM that it decided to take the cabin off and put in a whole new engine. And this was a 700 horsepower engine that was installed right here on the ship canal at Seattle's Washington Iron Works. And at that time, it was given the current name, the Arthur Foss. Arthur was the eldest son of Andrew and Thea Foss. So when this engine was put in, it became the most powerful tugboat on the West Coast, which means in general that it was doing the biggest tow jobs that there was. And I know I'm a bridge engineer, so I was very interested to find out that it worked on the Golden Gate Bridge, worked on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. It also worked on the Lacey Burrow Bridge, the first bridge crossing Lake Washington. One of the tasks it had there was they put a piece of the bridge out and they anchored it. Then they tied the piece of the bridge to the Arthur Foss, and it went full steam and tried to actually pull the bridge and wasn't able to budge it. So that was the way they did load testing back then of floating bridge parts. And the Arthur Foss was really the first vessel to accomplish that. Then in 1937, it was up at Discovery Bay, which is the bay just west of Port Townsend. It caught on fire, and there isn't a lot of fire service up there, even to this day. So the captain chose to run the tug up to the head of the bay, basically, and scuttled it in shallow water, and that put the fire out. And this photograph is after they had raised the vessel back up. It's still smoldering a little bit, but after they were able to secure the vessel, they towed it back to Tacoma, and it went through yet another retrofit and continued on with its service life. The next chapter in its life was went to war. It because it still was one of the larger tugs on the West Coast. It was towing large breakwaters from the California area to Honolulu. And the Navy was so impressed by its towing capacity that it kind of got indoctrinated into the Navy. Navy basically took it over, and it was giving the tow job between Hawaii and Wake Island, which is 2,500 miles through open sea. So another very tough towing job that was given to Arthur Foss. But one day it was at Wake Island, and the captain kept hearing rumors that the Japanese were going to attack various points in the Pacific, and he got nervous and he said, I need to get back to Hawaii. So he borrowed or took on most of the fuel from the sister ship to the Arthur Foss, the Justin Foss, and with all that fuel, headed back on a 12-hour trip back to Honolulu. And it just so happened that within hours of them leaving, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and several other major points throughout the Pacific. And actually, it turned out that the Justin Foss was captured. All of its crew was executed, and only one member of its crew actually was sent to a prisoner of war camp, and it turned out to be Andrew and Thea Foss's grandson, and he actually survived the war. None of the rest of the crew did. So the Arthur Foss is heading back to Hawaii. It doesn't really know whether it's even under U.S. Control anymore, but they were out in the middle of the ocean, so they had to go somewhere. So they cut off all radio contact, and the captain ordered that all the bilge oils be mixed with white paint, because he felt he was kind of a sitting duck out there in the Arthur Foss traditional colors of white and green, and painted the ship battleship gray out in the middle of the ocean, and he steamed on to Honolulu. And luckily, when he got back to Honolulu, was met by and escorted into the rather devastated Pearl Harbor by both the Navy and the Air Force. So it served the Navy in the Honolulu area, in the general Hawaii area, for several more years, until 1947, where the Navy turned it back to Foss. But by that time, the vessel is a rather unusual system. It's a direct drive diesel engine, which means that in order to change gears, you have to actually stop the engine and slide a gear over and then start the engine back up, and then you can go in a different direction. So by the time the 1947 rolled around, actually the Navy had very few people that could even run the vessel. So it had to be towed back in a dry dock to the California area. And unfortunately, on its way, a major storm came up, and the vessel was in a dry dock, tipped over, and suffered substantial damage to the starboard side. But that was repaired, and the vessel went on to do more and more towing. Until 1970, when by then it had quite a long service life, and the Foss Company decided to donate it to the Northwest Seaport, the current owner. This is what's called the presentation parade. So when Foss turns a vessel over to another owner, they often will gather many of their boats, and you can see the fireboat is in the background here as they paraded the Arthur Foss out of Elliott Bay. And at that time, the Northwest Seaport was in Kirkland. And so this is the vessel heading towards its home port in Kirkland. So now it's under the auspices of the Northwest Seaport. It's a floating museum, as I mentioned. The vessel now has classes. There's poetry classes. There's story hours for little young kids. They have sea shanty nights where they sing sea shanties on the vessel, sometimes on the Arthur, sometimes on the V5, Virginia 5, which is right next to it, South Lake Union. There's wooden boat classes where people learn how to maintain old wooden boats, which is a dying craft by any means you want to calculate. Diesel engine classes, old open boat tours, so that people can actually see what this old vessel is like. And it went and entered a few tugboat races. It can't do that now because of insurance issues and just physical issues with the operating systems. But I wanted to note that the tugboat races, which go on to this day, really had its origin in the 30s, 40s, because at that time there wasn't great radio communication, and so if a large vessel showed up on the horizon, the tugboats would actually race out to it, and the first one that got there got the job of the tow. So tugboat races really have a practical background, and the faster you could go, the more likely you were to get work. So it's the general history of the vessel. Then in June of 2017, the vessel needed a major maintenance haul out. They asked me to come in and be project manager for the haul out, which I did very happily. It was a great fun project. But the first thing that I ran into was, well, where do you take this vessel to haul out? It's 120 feet long, 600 tons. It's 15 feet of draft, and actually, there's very few places that you in the Lake Union area that have that kind of capacity. It turns out that Foss Shipyards, which is right along the ship canal, had a dry dock that they could use, and we negotiated a contract with them to bring it to Foss so that we could do a haul out. And this is their dry dock. Arthur is being towed into this dry dock. It could not drop in place. The dry dock couldn't drop in place because it wouldn't have enough clearance. So the dry dock had to be towed out to the ship canal and then held in place with another tug and line. And this is the vessel being floated into the dry dock. And then the dry dock is lifted up, and then the vessel is high and dry. All these underpinnings have to be put in place by a diver. So it's kind of a complicated operation, but we were able to pull it off. And this is shortly after the vessel has been made high and dry. And obviously the first thing that you have to do with an old vessel like this is you clean the bottom. And so this is the next day, if I go the right direction. And here we have a clean, dry bottom, which many people like. So then we could start in on the various aspects of the maintenance that was required. And the first thing we did was we moved the iron bark. Iron bark is put on wood vessels that go to Alaska because of all the ice, especially in spring breakup. So it's a very tough material. It's from Australia. It's very rare. It's very expensive, but it is not. It doesn't serve a good purpose once you stop needing it to protect a wood vessel from ice, because it holds water against the erosion of wood. So that meant that it had to be removed because it was actually causing quicker deterioration of the wood planking. So that was the first order of business, to take off the iron bark. And then we had to do a lot of integrity checking of the hull. So we had 2 marine surveyors come in to give us independent opinions as to the vessel's condition. We drilled holes in the bottom, and you look at the shavings of the wood, of course, and get a sense of whether the wood is still intact or is rotten. And we did find some rot. We did some caulking of areas that were obviously potential leaking areas. We did a LiDAR survey of the whole bottom of the vessel because it's if you're going to do any restoration, you need to know calculate. You have to be able to calculate the amount of wood, of course, that you need, and that's all based on lengths and where butt joints are. So we don't have original plans for the vessel, so getting this digital 3-dimensional mapping of the bottom of the hull was very important for us. We also had to replace anodes, which are the light colored metal strips that you see on the bottom. Anodes are a sacrificial metal that is attached to the metal of the bottom of vessels, and it sacrifices itself rather than sacrificing the steel to corrosion. The anodes that you see here, and here, this anode proved to be kind of a big problem to secure because it's unusually shaped. It had to be a specific diameter. It had to be hollow, and it had to be long enough that the propeller shaft extends out here, and a nut is put on the end of this. But we were able to get that shipped in and stay on schedule for our dry dock time. So after the iron bark was removed, we then felt we needed to put back some temporary sheathing. So we put on this black mastic, and then we put on Irish felt on top of that, and then we put on a marine grade plywood. Had to be relatively thin because it has to bend, sometimes double curvatures here. And this proved to be quite a jigsaw puzzle. So each piece had to have a template made, and that not only gave us the shape, but also the hull is rotten in some places, so you can't just put screws anywhere. We had big 8-inch screws that had to go into solid wood so we could mark the template where the screws could go in so that we could cover the entire bottom with this plywood sheathing. This is a picture of the top of the engine, 6 cylinders. Very loud, very complicated engine to run. But we did some minor maintenance on the engine, and then we checked the propeller shaft for leakage and checked all the through-hull fittings, and all of that went relatively well. Then we put the bottom paint on, and then we were ready to take it back out and have splash day. So this is the boat being in dry dock, being towed back out to the ship canal so it could drop down. And as with any wooden boat, after it's been out of the water for a period of time, this was out of the water 12 days, the wood shrinks. So you have to re-wet the boat very slowly, very carefully. So the dry dock is dropped. There's divers in the water to check, pull blocking away. And during this time, of course, we're checking the leak rate. So you check the bills for how much water is coming in, and it started out about 50 gallons an hour, and that was acceptable to us. We were able to handle that with pumps and tanks and so forth. So we had a little celebration, and then as the day went on, and the evening wore on, we were seeing more and more water coming in. And by 8 o'clock that night, we were up to 500 gallons an hour rather than 50. And that was a serious problem because the water comes into the vessel, it settles into the bilge area. The bilge area has lots of oils and petroleum products. So basically, you end up with a hazardous material that has to be pumped off. We had to pump it off to a tanker truck every 2 hours throughout the night on an emergency basis. So that cost a few nickels that luckily we had in the budget, but that was getting to be a very expensive situation. So in the morning, we called in a diver who swam the whole hull and tried to find places where there might be holes, and they located a couple. And so those were patched with underwater epoxy, but it didn't slow down the flow rate. So then we went to plan B, which was an old trick that's often used of just putting sawdust in the water. So you drag a burlap bag of sawdust by ropes underneath the hull and release the sawdust, and the sawdust will tend to go into the areas where water is coming into the vessel and can close off leaks. And in our case, that didn't help because the leaks were too big. So we had to go to plan C, which was we went and bought a mustard bottle and some green dye, and the diver had to go through thousands and thousands of feet of joints with the green dye, squirting the green dye into the water. And if the green dye disappears, that means it's gone into the boat, and that means you have a leak. And using this method, which took probably 4 hours or more of dye time, they were able to locate 6 major leaks at unusual locations. And we were able to patch those with underwater epoxy, and then we were able to head back to home port, which is back at South Lake Union. This is going through the Fremont Bridge, of course, and we were able to get it back, continue its museum services. So our conclusion through our entire Haulout project was that the vessel is in relatively good shape, considering it's 131 years old and wood, but it needs to go through a major restoration. We're estimating that is somewhere between $4 and $10 million, which will depend partially on the historical restoration requirements for a historic vessel. So if you happen to have a few $1 million laying around and would like to donate it to a good cause, I'd request that you text that to Arthur 1889 at 44-321. That concludes my talk. And so, Steve, if we have time for any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
You bet. Thank you for going through that. Now, where exactly can we go see it on Lake Washington?
It's at the south end of Lake Union. It's just in front of Mohi.
Oh, yeah, okay.
There's a bunch of piers there called the Historic Wharf. So the Virginia 5 is there, Arthur is there.
Yes.
We also have a Swiftshear boat. We also have a 1910 wooden trawler, the Torgen Shoal. There's a fireboat there also, and then there, Center for Wooden Boats is adjacent to us. So it's not open every day, but you can certainly see it by appointment. And then it's open during festivals, like there's a working boat festival and a wooden boat festival when things open up again. And the boats open then. If you wanted to get a group of people together, I'd be more than happy to give you a personal tour at your convenience. So I guess people have to unmute if they want to ask questions. Is that, or are you using the chat room, or?
Yeah, they'll need to unmute themselves
Okay.
if they have a question.
Okay.
So Richard, this is Alan Murray. It was a very good presentation. I found it interesting that you sheathed it in plywood, and what do you think the lifespan is now at this point before you have to be concerned about the ship sinking in the middle of the winter or something like that?
Well, we think we have to accomplish a major restoration in the next 5 to 10 years. The when we took the iron bark off, the wood sheathing was planking, excuse me, was in poor shape in certain areas. Near the water line tends to be where you get the worst deterioration, where you get oxygen and moisture combined. So that we felt we needed to put that temporary sheathing back on. And unfortunately, it makes it look like a steel boat, but that's what was really necessary to preserve it until we can do a full restoration, which is what we believe it needs at this point.
Can you hear me, Richard?
Yes.
Hey, hi, Patrick Hussey here on WWII Island. Thank you. That was so interesting. My question is, are there modern tugs now that are of comparable size and power to this historic tug?
The modern vessels are even stronger, and they're more maneuverable. So Foss and other companies have started building something called tractor tugs, and so they have these big uh, housings that go down into the water below the hull, and sometimes 2 or 3 of them, and those have propellers that can turn up to 360 degrees. And so normally they have a couple of them, or maybe even 3 of them, and so those make the vessel very maneuverable. And then they're putting huge engines in them, thousands of horsepower sometimes. So the vessels today, especially in the big commercial ports, Seattle, Tacoma, Long Beach, LA, those that are dealing with big cargo ships, those tugs are really remarkable compared to the Arthur. But in its day, I mean, it was the biggest and most powerful. It's not today, but because of its age and because it has an interesting history, we think that it's something that should be restored and kept in the fleet of historic vessels. Excuse me.
This is Alan Murray again. It's interesting to note that those tractor tugs, they actually look like they're standing up and dancing. They get going and they can spin them at 360 degrees in one place.
Yes, they are remarkable. I mean, sometimes they, I think they're more showing off than than of practical use, but they're very maneuverable, very powerful. They're really something to see in action.
This is Davelaine. Another question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. presently on Maui, so I was interested to learn of the sea passages that the Arthur made. Question. Back in the day of the large lumber mills on Puget Sound, Port Madison, then Port Blakely, and others, my understanding is that the sailing vessels, which were often 3 and maybe even 4 masted lumber schooners, used tugboats to haul them up to the straits where they could pick up some wind. Is that a fact? And was the Arthur used for that?
It was, well, yes, that's true. Because sometimes the winds on the inside are not strong enough. And the Arthur was used for that occasionally. But more often than not, it was hauling logs. But certainly there were times when the large sailboats needed to be hauled up or towed up to the straits to get the enough winds, because those vessels were very large, and so they needed a lot of sail capacity, and so you needed a fair amount of wind to move them.
Say, Richard,
Yes.
you mentioned that the renovation needs to happen soon, or is there some danger to the Arthur Foss for sinking or something, or what is there urgency and just decaying, or what's the urgency?
Well, the urgency is that the vessel is slowly deteriorating. So, I mean, if nothing was done, eventually the rot would become so great that you couldn't keep up with it with an occasional, replacing a plank here or there. It just gets to be more and more wood needs to be replaced, and it's hard to get replacement wood because it technically needs to be old growth material. Because that was what was originally used, and that's historically accurate. So, so there is not an immediate danger today, but we know because of the rate of deterioration it's gone through over the last few decades that if nothing is done within the upcoming decade, that it'll get to a point where, like the Wawona, it just becomes uneconomical to replace. Just we're estimating just the lumber alone, because it needs to be old growth and very large dimensions, is probably on the order of 3 to 4 million. And that, if you wait to a point where that number gets to be 10 million and up, then at some point it just doesn't become economically viable to replace. So we think now is the time to start making the plans for restoration while it's still within reach. Historic restorations of old vessels in the $4 to $10 million range is not unreasonable if you look at throughout the United States or the world on what restoration projects have taken. That's actually a reasonable budget for the amount of money it takes to restore old vessels.
Thank you. Could you talk more about the specific old growth or the kind of trees it was made out of and how big of dimensions you're talking?
Well, to be historically accurate, it needs to be old growth. And the dimensions of the planking is 4 inches thick, but there's quite long lengths. And the vessel's 120 feet, so you need lengths of 30, 40 feet, ideally. The ribs of the hull are 8 inches by 12 inches. And those are 12-inch on center. So, and those need to be curved And so you need to start with a pretty large piece of wood in order to cut a curve into the ribs of the hull.
Oh yeah. What is it? Cedar or is it what kind of wood?
Fir.
Fir, like a Douglas fir?
Yeah, Douglas fir. So some specialty items around the boat might use different woods, but the majority is Doug fir. If there aren't any more questions, I can wrap up so you can move on with your meeting. But feel free to contact me if you have any more questions or if you want to put together a group tour sometime. I'm more than happy to make that happen.